On his way home, a hardworking boy named Ethan Carter finds a lost wallet and returns it to its owner, an old and reclusive man named Mr. Preston. However, the next day, a police officer unexpectedly shows up at Ethan's door. What could be the reason behind this surprising visit? Before we dive into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy heartwarming tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Ethan Carter, a 13-year-old boy with a knack for responsibility, adjusted the straps of his well-worn backpack as he stepped out of the bustling school building. The golden afternoon sunlight painted his freckled face as he breathed deeply in the crisp autumn air. Despite the school day ending, Ethan's day was far from over. With a determined smile, he turned onto the sidewalk, heading toward his part-time job at the local newspaper company. His thoughts drifted as he walked, mostly to the upcoming school trip to the state capital. It was the kind of opportunity Ethan had dreamed about for months, a chance to visit historic landmarks and learn about the state's rich history. Yet, the excitement was tinged with concern. The trip came with a steep price tag, one his hardworking mother couldn't easily afford. This worry had driven Ethan to take on the part-time job in the first place. He gave a small nod of encouragement as he muttered, "I can do this. Just a little more saving, and I'll have enough." As he walked, the familiar red brick building of the newspaper office appeared. The large windows glinted in the sunlight, and Ethan couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he approached. Pushing open the heavy glass door, he was immediately greeted by the familiar aroma of ink and paper, and the bustling sounds of phones ringing and voices conversing. "Hey there, Ethan," Mrs. Porter, the warm and friendly receptionist, called out. She gave him an approving smile. "Right on time, as always," Ethan grinned back. "Hi, Mrs. Porter. Anything special for me today?" She handed him a neat stack of freshly printed newspapers. "Just the usual route, sweetheart, but Mr. Daniels mentioned he might have an extra task for you later." Ethan nodded eagerly and set off to the back room, where he organized the papers for delivery. The routine was calming in simplicity, and as he worked, Ethan couldn't help but feel grateful for the opportunity. Life wasn't always easy. His mother worked long hours to provide for him, and Ethan wanted to do his part. Once his delivery bag was packed, Ethan set off on his route. House by house, he carefully placed each paper where customers preferred, on porches, inside mailboxes, or tucked behind screen doors. Despite the bag's weight tugging at his shoulders, Ethan carried on with pride. Every delivery, no matter how small, brought him closer to earning his spot on the school trip. Ethan finished his last delivery as the sun dipped lower, casting warm hues across the quiet streets. His arms ached slightly from the day's work, but his heart felt lighter. Slinging his now empty bag over one shoulder, he headed back to the office, wondering what extra task Mr. Daniels might have for him. After bidding goodbye to Mrs. Porter, Ethan stepped out into the evening air. The sky was vibrant orange and pink as he began his familiar walk home. The streets were quiet, and Ethan's mind wandered between thoughts of dinner and the homework waiting for him. Rounding a quiet corner, something unusual caught his eye. A brown leather wallet lying abandoned on the sidewalk. Ethan froze, glancing around to see if anyone was nearby. The street was empty, except for the rustling of leaves in the soft breeze. Curiosity piqued, he bent down to pick up the wallet. It felt heavier than expected, and when he opened it, his eyes widened in surprise. Inside were crisp bills neatly folded alongside a driver's license and a few credit cards. For a brief moment, a tempting thought crossed Ethan's mind. The money could easily cover the cost of his school trip and more. It would make things so much easier. But almost immediately, guilt tugged at his heartstrings. He thought of his mother, who had always emphasized honesty, even when times were tough. What would Mom say if she knew I even thought about keeping this? Ethan murmured to himself, his face tinged with shame. Taking a deep breath, Ethan made up his mind. Whoever this wallet belonged to was probably worried sick about losing it. Doing the right thing mattered more than any amount of money. With renewed resolve, he carefully tucked the wallet into his backpack. He'd figure out how to return it safely once he got home. The rest of the walk home was quiet, but Ethan felt a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't always easy to do the right thing, especially when life seemed to offer an easier path. Yet, as the glow of the streetlights illuminated his steps, Ethan knew he had made the right choice. When he finally reached his modest home, a warm glow from the windows greeted him. Pushing open the door, Ethan was met with the comforting aroma of a home-cooked meal. "Hey, Mom," he called out, his voice laced with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Miss Carter appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her tired face lit up as she saw her son. "Ethan, sweetheart, you're home. How was your day?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before pulling the wallet from his backpack and holding it up. "You won't believe what I found on the way home." Her brows furrowed as she stepped closer. "What is it?" Ethan explained everything. The quiet street, the abandoned wallet, and the money inside. He ended with a resolute promise. "I'm going to find the owner and return it." Miss Carter's expression softened, her pride evident. "That's my boy," she said warmly, ruffling his hair. "You're doing the right thing, Ethan. I'm proud of you." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat at her words. His mother's support meant everything to him. That night, as he lay in bed, the wallet resting on his desk, Ethan thought about the name on the driver's license, Mr. Arthur Preston. Tomorrow, he'd take the next step in doing the right thing. The next morning, Ethan awoke early, determined to return the wallet. As he ate his breakfast, his eyes kept darting to the brown leather wallet resting on the edge of the kitchen table. His mother, Miss Carter, noticed his quiet demeanor and offered an encouraging smile. "You've got this, Ethan," she said warmly. "Just be polite and honest. It'll be fine." Ethan nodded, though his nerves hadn't quite settled. After finishing his cereal, he grabbed his backpack and carefully placed the wallet inside. On his way out the door, Miss Carter called after him. "Good luck, sweetheart." The name on the driver's license had stuck with him all night. Arthur Preston. The address on the ID card led to Oak Lane, a street he knew well for its large, imposing houses. Ethan had passed by them plenty of times on his newspaper route, always imagining the lives of the people who lived there. It wasn't until this morning that he realized one of those houses belonged to the mysterious Mr. Preston. The neighborhood buzzed with quiet whispers about him. Some said he was grumpy and unapproachable. Others described him as merely lonely. Ethan tried not to let the rumors get to him, but as he turned onto Oak Lane, his heart began to race. The houses grew grander with every step, their manicured lawns and pristine fences, starkly different from his own modest neighborhood. Ethan finally reached the address on the ID card and stopped short, his eyes widening at the sight before him. Mr. Preston's house was a sprawling brick mansion, its walls weathered with age. Ivy crept up one side, and though the front yard was neat, there was an air of neglect about the place. The paint on the shutters peeled, and the bushes lining the driveway looked overgrown. Ethan swallowed hard and adjusted the straps of his backpack. "You can do this," he whispered under his breath. With careful steps, he made his way up the long driveway, his sneakers crunching against the gravel. When he reached the large wooden door, he hesitated. The door's intricate carvings seemed to stare back at him, almost daring him to knock. Ethan's hand hovered in the air, trembling slightly. What if he's mean? He wondered aloud. But then he remembered his mother's words and took a deep breath. Summoning his courage, Ethan rapped firmly on the door. The sound echoed through the quiet estate, and for a moment, nothing happened. Just as Ethan was about to knock again, he heard the shuffle of footsteps from inside. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with wispy white hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to pierce through Ethan. His face was stern, his thick eyebrows furrowed in suspicion. "Yes?" the man said gruffly, his voice low and unwelcoming. Ethan's mouth went dry. He suddenly felt very small in his worn sneakers and slightly wrinkled shirt. Hello, Mr. Preston?" he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man's expression didn't soften. "Who's asking?" Ethan cleared his throat and reached into his backpack, pulling out the wallet. I found this yesterday on the sidewalk near Oak Lane. The driver's license said it was yours, so I wanted to return it." He held out the wallet, his hands trembling slightly. Mr. Preston's sharp gaze flickered to the wallet, then back to Ethan. Slowly, he reached out and took it. His weathered fingers brushed against Ethan's palm, and for a moment, the boy thought he saw a hint of surprise in the old man's eyes. Opening the wallet, Mr. Preston quickly scanned its contents. checking the cash and credit cards. When everything appeared to be intact, his expression shifted just slightly. The suspicion in his eyes gave way to something else. Gratitude, perhaps. "Thank you," Mr. Preston said gruffly, though his tone was less harsh than before. "That was honest of you." Ethan nodded quickly, eager to escape the awkwardness. "You're welcome, sir. I just thought it was the right thing to do." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Finally, Mr. Preston gave a curt nod. "Well, I appreciate it. Not many kids your age would do something like this." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply smiled and turned to leave. His heart was pounding as he walked down the long driveway, the encounter replaying in his mind. Mr. Preston's piercing gaze had been intimidating, but there had been something else there, too, something softer beneath the surface. As he reached the sidewalk, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He couldn't help but feel proud of himself for following through, even if the interaction hadn't exactly been warm. On his way home, Ethan wondered about Mr. Preston. The rumors painted him as a grumpy recluse, but now Ethan wasn't so sure. There had been a flicker of something in the old man's eyes, a hint of surprise, maybe even respect. That evening, Ethan shared the story with his mother over dinner. Miss Carter listened intently, her face lighting up with pride. "I knew you'd do the right thing, Ethan," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. Not everyone would have had the courage to return that wallet, especially to someone like Mr. Preston. Ethan shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. It just felt like the right thing to do. Later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Ethan felt a warm sense of satisfaction. The money in the wallet might have solved some short-term problems, but the feeling of doing the right thing was worth so much more. Little did he know, the decision he'd made that day was only the beginning of a journey that would change both his life and Mr. Preston's forever. The morning after Ethan returned the wallet, the Carter household started like any other day. Ethan was busy gathering his books for school, and Miss Carter was getting ready for her shift at the diner. Their modest home was filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the comforting hum of the radio. Ethan was about to head out the door when a firm knock echoed through the house. He paused, exchanging a curious glance with his mother. "Are you expecting anyone?" he asked. Miss Carter shook her head and walked to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. When she opened it, her breath hitched. Standing on the porch was a tall, uniformed police officer, his badge glinting in the morning sunlight. "Good morning, ma'am," the officer said politely, tipping his cap. "Is this the Carter residence?" Miss Carter nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes, it is. Is everything all right?" The officer smiled kindly and stepped aside, revealing someone standing behind him, none other than Mr. Preston. He looked slightly uncomfortable, his hands clasped tightly around a small black cane. "Mr. Preston," Miss Carter said, her voice laced with surprise. "What brings you here?" Ethan, who had been peeking around the corner, froze, his stomach twisted with anxiety. Had he done something wrong? "Is your son home?" Mr. Preston asked, his voice softer than Ethan remembered. "He is," Miss Carter replied, turning to call out. "Ethan, come here, sweetheart." Reluctantly, Ethan stepped into the doorway, his heart pounding. "Good morning," he said cautiously, his gaze shifting between the officer and Mr. Preston. The officer cleared his throat and gave Ethan an encouraging nod. "Relax, son. You're not in any trouble. We're here because Mr. Preston has something he'd like to say." Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion as he looked at the elderly man. Mr. Preston took a deep breath and began. "Yesterday, you returned something very valuable to me, my wallet. But what you didn't know is that it wasn't just the money inside that mattered." His voice wavered slightly, and he tightened his grip on the cane. "That wallet held something precious to me, a photograph of my late wife, Margaret. It's one of the few reminders I have left of her. When I realized it was missing, I thought I'd never see it again." Ethan blinked in surprise. He hadn't noticed the photograph while inspecting the wallet, but hearing Mr. Preston's words made him realize how much it must have meant to him. "I owe you a great debt of gratitude," Mr. Preston continued, his blue eyes softening. "Your honesty and integrity are rare these days, especially in someone so young." Ethan felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I just did what anyone should do," he mumbled. No, Ethan, Mr. Preston said firmly, his voice carrying unexpected warmth. What you did was extraordinary, and I wanted to thank you properly. With that, Mr. Preston turned to the police officer, who handed him a small envelope. Mr. Preston held it out to Ethan, who stared at it in confusion. Go on, Mr. Preston urged. Take it. Ethan hesitated before accepting the envelope. When he opened it, his eyes widened. Inside was a letter outlining a full scholarship to cover his education expenses through high school and even college. What is this? Ethan stammered, looking up at Mr. Preston with disbelief. It's my way of ensuring your future, Ethan, Mr. Preston said simply. You've shown me that you have the character and potential to do great things. I don't want finances to stand in the way of that. Tears welled up in Miss Carter's eyes as she placed a hand on her son's shoulder. Mr. Preston, it's more than we could ever hope for, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. You've already given us so much by recognizing Ethan's goodness, she continued. I don't know how we can thank you enough. You don't need to, Mr. Preston replied, his voice steady. This is something I want to do, and truthfully, I think it's something Margaret would have wanted as well. Ethan was still struggling to find the words. The reality of the moment was overwhelming. I don't know what to say, he finally managed. Thank you, Mr. Preston. I promise I won't waste this opportunity. Mr. Preston's lips curved into the faintest smile. I know you won't, Ethan. The police officer, Officer Clark, stepped forward, his tone light and friendly. Well, I think my work here is done. It's not every day I get to deliver good news like this. You're a lucky young man, Ethan. As Officer Clark and Mr. Preston turned to leave, Miss Carter invited them in for a cup of coffee. Mr. Preston hesitated, but eventually accepted. Sitting in the cozy living room, Mr. Preston opened up more than Ethan had expected. He spoke about his late wife, who had been a passionate advocate for education, and how much she would have admired Ethan's honesty. She always believed in investing in people, Mr. Preston said, his gaze distant but warm. I see that same spirit in you, Ethan. By the time Mr. Preston left, the atmosphere in the Carter household was filled with gratitude and hope. Miss Carter hugged her son tightly after closing the door, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ethan, you've made me so proud, she whispered. Not just because of the scholarship, but because of the kind, honest person you are. Ethan hugged her back, feeling a lump rise in his throat. I just wanted to do the right thing, Mom. You did, sweetheart, she said, pulling back to look him in the eyes. And look what it's brought into our lives. That night, Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to stop replaying the day's events in his mind. The scholarship, the stories about Mr. Preston's wife, and the warmth in his mother's voice filled him with a deep sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt that his future was brighter than he'd ever imagined. But more than that, he felt something even more important, a growing connection to Mr. Preston. One that he sensed was just the beginning. Ethan adjusted the straps of his backpack as he walked up the familiar driveway of Mr. Preston's grand estate. This was the third time he had visited since the day Mr. Preston established the scholarship, and what had started as a simple act of gratitude was quickly blossoming into something more. Mr. Preston greeted him at the door with a rare smile. His once guarded demeanor seemed to soften each time Ethan came by. Come in, Ethan, he said, stepping aside. Ethan entered the house, glancing around at the ornate but slightly neglected interior. The furniture was elegant, but the air of loneliness still hung heavy in the room. Mr. Preston led him to the kitchen, where a pot of tea and a plate of cookies awaited on the counter. How was school today? Mr. Preston asked as they settled at the small kitchen table. It was good, Ethan replied, pouring himself a cup of tea. We started a new unit in science, and it's kind of tough but interesting. Mr. Preston nodded thoughtfully. I always liked science. It teaches you to think critically, something you seem to do naturally. Ethan blushed at the compliment and quickly changed the subject. So, Mr. Preston, is there anything I can help you with today? Maybe the garden? Mr. Preston raised an eyebrow. You're quite eager, aren't you? He said, though there was a twinkle in his eye. All right, let's take a look outside. That poor garden could certainly use some attention. The two stepped out into the backyard, where overgrown hedges and weeds had taken over what must have once been a beautiful space. Ethan could almost imagine it in its former glory, a vibrant, lively garden filled with flowers of every color. "This used to be Margaret's pride and joy," Mr. Preston said softly, gesturing to a weathered trellis where faded roses clung to brittle vines. "She spent hours out here, making it beautiful." Ethan glanced at Mr. Preston, noticing the distant look in his eyes. "Why don't we fix it up together?" he suggested. Mr. Preston seemed taken aback by the idea, but nodded after a moment of thought. "That might be nice," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. And so, their project began. Every Tuesday and Thursday after Ethan's newspaper shift, he would head to Mr. Preston's house. Together, they worked tirelessly in the garden, clearing out weeds, pruning bushes, and planting new flowers. Ethan found himself looking forward to these visits more than anything else. As they worked side by side, Mr. Preston began to share stories about his life. He spoke of his childhood in a small town, his early career struggles, and the adventures he'd had with Margaret. "She was the one who kept me grounded," Mr. Preston said one afternoon as they planted a row of daisies. "She had this way of making everything feel possible, no matter how hard life got." Ethan listened intently, fascinated by the glimpses into Mr. Preston's past. In return, he shared his own dreams and fears, how he hoped to become a journalist someday, how he worried about his mother working so hard, and how he sometimes felt out of place at school. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Ethan," Mr. Preston said, patting him on the back, "and a kind heart to match. You'll go far in life, mark my words." The words filled Ethan with a sense of pride and determination. It wasn't just the garden they were nurturing. It was a growing bond that felt like family. Over time, the once neglected garden began to transform. Roses bloomed along the trellis, vibrant marigolds and daisies dotted the flower beds, and lush green grass replaced the overgrown weeds. Ethan's hands, once soft, now bore calluses from hours of digging and planting, but he didn't mind. One sunny afternoon, as they stood admiring their handiwork, Ethan turned to Mr. Preston. "It's starting to look amazing. I bet Mrs. Preston would have loved this." Mr. Preston's eyes misted over, and he nodded. "She would have," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I think she'd be proud of you, Ethan. I know I am." Their time together wasn't limited to the garden. On rainy days, they worked on small projects inside the house. Ethan helped Mr. Preston organize old photographs and letters, many of which were tied to memories of his wife. "This was taken on our first anniversary," Mr. Preston said, holding up a faded black and white photograph of a young couple standing arm in arm. "We were so young, so full of dreams." Ethan smiled as he listened to the story behind the photo, feeling a deep sense of connection to Mr. Preston's history. As their bond deepened, Mr. Preston began to smile more often. His once isolated house now echoed with laughter and conversation. Ethan found himself viewing the elderly man not just as someone he'd helped, but as a mentor and even a grandfather figure. One day, as they were tidying up the attic, Ethan stumbled across a dusty chessboard. "Do you play?" he asked, holding it up. "Do I play?" Mr. Preston repeated, a mischievous glint in his eye. "I used to be quite the chess champion in my day." That evening, they set up the board in the living room, and Mr. Preston patiently taught Ethan the rules and strategies. What began as a simple game turned into a weekly tradition, with Ethan improving bit by bit under Mr. Preston's tutelage. "You're getting better," Mr. Preston remarked during one particularly intense match. "Maybe one day I'll even beat you," Ethan replied with a grin. Mr. Preston chuckled. "Keep dreaming, kid." Through these moments, working in the garden, sharing stories, and playing chess, Ethan and Mr. Preston became an inseparable duo. The old man's house, once a symbol of loneliness, now felt warm and alive. Miss Carter noticed the change in Ethan, too. Her son seemed happier, more confident, and more focused. She couldn't help but smile as he shared stories about his time with Mr. Preston over dinner. "I'm glad you found someone like Mr. Preston," she said one evening, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Me too, Mom," Ethan replied. "He's taught me so much, not just about gardening or chess, but about life." As the weeks turned into months, the garden flourished, and so did their friendship. For Ethan, the time spent with Mr. Preston was no longer about repaying a debt of gratitude. It had become something far more meaningful, a connection that felt like family. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the tie of his brand-new school uniform. It was crisp and sharp, but the fabric felt stiff and unfamiliar against his skin. Today was the first day at his new school, Maplewood Academy, a prestigious institution funded by the scholarship Mr. Preston had generously established. "You look so grown up," Miss Carter said from behind him, her voice filled with pride. "Margaret Preston would be so proud to see you wearing that uniform." "And I know Mr. Preston is." Ethan gave her a small smile. "I hope I don't mess this up, Mom." "You won't," she said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Just be yourself, Ethan. That's what got you here in the first place." With a deep breath, Ethan grabbed his backpack and headed out the door. The grand building of Maplewood Academy loomed ahead, its polished stone facade gleaming in the morning sun. As he stepped through the towering entrance, the bustling hallways were alive with students who seemed to exude confidence. Almost immediately, Ethan felt out of place. The chatter around him was peppered with conversations about ski trips, horseback riding, and vacations in exotic places. It was a stark contrast to the simple life he shared with his mother, and for the first time, doubt began to creep in. He shuffled through the hall, clutching his schedule tightly. His first class was advanced literature, a subject he usually enjoyed. Yet, as he entered the classroom, the sight of students already discussing novels he hadn't even heard of made his stomach churn. The teacher, Mrs. Langston, introduced Ethan to the class, and though some students offered polite smiles, others whispered to one another behind their hands. Ethan sank into his seat, feeling smaller than ever. As the day went on, the weight of the new environment began to press down on him. The workload was overwhelming, with teachers assigning essays, projects, and quizzes at a pace he wasn't used to. His classmates breezed through discussions with ease while Ethan struggled to keep up. By lunchtime, Ethan found himself sitting alone in the cafeteria, poking at a sandwich he wasn't hungry enough to eat. Around him, groups of students laughed and chatted about their plans for the weekend. One group was planning a trip to a nearby ski lodge. Another was discussing a gala at the local art museum. Ethan couldn't help but feel like an outsider. His modest life couldn't compare to the opulence that seemed to define his classmates. When he got home that evening, Ethan dropped his backpack by the door and slumped onto the couch. Miss Carter immediately noticed his downcast expression. "Rough first day?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded. "I just don't think I belong there, Mom. Everyone's so different. Smarter, richer, more confident. I feel like I'm playing catch-up in every class." Miss Carter sat beside him and pulled him into a comforting hug. "Ethan, you've always been a fighter. Remember when you started your newspaper job? You didn't know the routes or the customers, but you figured it out because you worked hard and didn't give up." "But this feels different," Ethan said quietly. "Different doesn't mean impossible," Miss Carter replied. "And you're not alone in this. You've got me and you've got Mr. Preston. You've got people who believe in you." Ethan felt a flicker of hope as he nodded. "Thanks, Mom." Later that week, during one of his regular visits to Mr. Preston, Ethan opened up about his struggles at Maplewood. As they sat on the garden bench, Ethan recounted the overwhelming workload and the feeling of being out of place among his classmates. Mr. Preston listened intently, his piercing blue eyes full of understanding. When Ethan finished, the older man leaned forward and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Ethan," Mr. Preston began, "success isn't about fitting in. It's about standing out for the right reasons. And you've already proven that you have what it takes to succeed. It's not going to be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is." Ethan nodded, trying to absorb the wisdom in Mr. Preston's words. "Focus on what you can control," Mr. Preston continued. "Your attitude, your effort, and your integrity. The rest will fall into place." Taking those words to heart, Ethan decided to approach Maplewood with a renewed sense of determination. He began spending extra hours in the library, poring over books to catch up on subjects he found difficult. He sought help from teachers during office hours, swallowing his pride to ask questions when he didn't understand something. Slowly but surely, Ethan began to make progress. In advanced literature, he surprised himself and his teacher when he delivered a thoughtful analysis of a novel he'd read over the weekend. In math, A subject he had always struggled with, Ethan's extra studying paid off when he aced his first quiz. During lunch, Ethan noticed a new boy sitting alone at a table. Gathering his courage, Ethan approached him. "Hey, I'm Ethan," he said. "Mind if I join you?" The boy smiled gratefully. "Sure, I'm Adam. I just transferred here, so I don't really know anyone yet." As they ate together, Ethan realized that he wasn't the only one who felt out of place. By the end of lunch, the two had bonded over their shared experiences of being the new kid. Ethan's act of kindness didn't go unnoticed. Over time, his classmates began to see him in a new light, not as an outsider, but as someone approachable and genuine. When Mrs. Langston assigned a group project in advanced literature, several students immediately asked to work with Ethan. "You always have such unique ideas," one of them said, making Ethan blush. The small victories began to add up, and Ethan's confidence grew. He realized that while Maplewood was challenging, it was also an opportunity, a chance to push himself and prove that he belonged. On one of his visits to Mr. Preston, Ethan shared his recent successes with pride. "I'm starting to feel like I can handle this," he said, a wide smile spreading across his face. Mr. Preston nodded, his own expression warm with approval. "I never doubted you for a second, Ethan. You're proving that hard work and determination can overcome any obstacle." Ethan beamed at the praise, feeling a surge of gratitude for the guidance and support Mr. Preston had given him. As he walked home that evening, the lights of the neighborhood twinkling in the distance, Ethan felt a sense of accomplishment. He still had a long way to go, but he was beginning to see that Maplewood wasn't just a school. It was a place where he could grow academically, socially, and personally. And no matter how tough things got, Ethan knew he wasn't alone. With his mother's unwavering belief in him and Mr. Preston's mentorship, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Ethan adjusted his gloves as he stood beside Mr. Preston at the entrance to the bustling town park. The annual community fair was in full swing, with colorful stalls and lively music filling the air. Children darted between booths, their laughter echoing through the park, while families browsed crafts and sampled snacks from food vendors. For Ethan, the fair wasn't just an exciting event. It marked a new chapter in Mr. Preston's life. Once a recluse, Mr. Preston had started venturing out of his shell, inspired by his growing friendship with Ethan. When the opportunity arose to volunteer at the fair, Mr. Preston surprised everyone by agreeing to participate. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Preston?" Ethan asked, noticing the slight hesitation in the older man's stance. Mr. Preston glanced at him, his blue eyes glinting with determination. "I've lived in this town for decades, Ethan," he said. "It's high time I gave something back. Besides," he added with a faint smile, "you'll be here, won't you?" Ethan grinned. "Of course." The two made their way to the volunteer booth, where they were assigned to run a ring toss game. The stall was simple, a row of colorful bottles and a basket of plastic rings, but it quickly drew a crowd of excited children, eager to try their luck. Ethan manned the game, encouraging each participant with cheerful enthusiasm. "Almost got it. One more try," he'd say, his voice bright and infectious. Beside him, Mr. Preston handed out small prizes, such as stuffed animals, toy cars, and colorful bracelets. At first, Mr. Preston seemed a little stiff, but his interactions were formal and brief. But as the hours passed, something shifted. A little girl with pigtails and a shy smile approached the booth, clutching a wrinkled dollar bill. "Can I try?" she asked timidly. Mr. Preston knelt slightly to meet her gaze. "Of course, young lady," he said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "Let's see what you've got." The girl's first two throws missed, but on her third attempt, the ring landed squarely on a bottle. She squealed with delight as Mr. Preston handed her a stuffed bunny, his own smile widening at her joy. "Well done," he said warmly. "You've got quite the aim." From that moment on, Mr. Preston seemed to relax, engaging with each child who visited the booth. His gruff exterior softened as he laughed and chatted with families, his deep voice resonating with a newfound warmth. Ethan watched in awe, marveling at the transformation. This was the same man who had once been the subject of whispered rumors about his aloofness and cold demeanor. Yet here he was, blending seamlessly into the vibrant tapestry of the community. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan and Mr. Preston took a break to wander through the fair. They sampled caramel popcorn, watched a group of teenagers perform a lively dance routine, and even joined a pie-eating contest, much to Ethan's amusement. "You've got whipped cream on your nose, Mr. Preston," Ethan teased, barely able to contain his laughter. Mr. Preston chuckled, wiping his face with a handkerchief. "It's been years since I've done something this ridiculous," he admitted, his voice tinged with amusement. Ethan grinned. "You're pretty good at it. Maybe we'll make a tradition out of this." As they continued to explore the fair, they came across a booth raising funds for the town's youth center. A large banner displayed the center's mission, providing after-school programs and resources for underprivileged children. Mr. Preston's expression grew thoughtful as he read the sign. "I didn't realize this town had such a program," he said. "It's a great place," Ethan replied. "A lot of kids go there to get help with homework or just hang out. It's especially important for families who can't afford tutors or extracurriculars." Mr. Preston nodded, his gaze lingering on the booth. "I think it's time I contributed to something meaningful," he said quietly. The next day, Mr. Preston made a generous donation to the youth center, ensuring that its programs could expand and reach even more children. Ethan couldn't help but feel proud, knowing that his friendship had inspired Mr. Preston to re-engage with the community. From that point on, Mr. Preston became an active presence in town. He attended council meetings, offering his insights on community projects. He volunteered at the local library, helping organize book drives. And every week, he and Ethan returned to the youth center to mentor kids, teaching them everything from gardening to chess. Ethan noticed how much joy these activities brought to Mr. Preston. The once lonely man seemed more vibrant and alive than ever, his days filled with purpose and connection. One evening, after a particularly lively chess lesson at the youth center, Ethan and Mr. Preston sat on a park bench watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Thank you, Ethan," Mr. Preston said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan turned to him, puzzled. "For what?" "For reminding me of what it means to be part of something bigger," Mr. Preston replied. "I spent so many years keeping to myself, shutting out the world. But you've shown me that life is richer when you share it with others." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "I think you've done the same for me," he said softly. "You've taught me so much, not just about gardening or chess, but about giving back and staying true to who I am." Mr. Preston smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Well, I suppose we make a pretty good team, don't we?" Ethan nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the bond they had built. As the weeks went by, the garden at Mr. Preston's house became a hub of activity. Neighbors stopped by to admire the vibrant blooms and offer their compliments. Some even joined Ethan and Mr. Preston, lending a hand with planting and pruning. "It's amazing what a little effort can do," Mr. Preston remarked one afternoon as they stood among the flourishing flowers. "This garden has become a reflection of everything we've worked for: growth, renewal, connection." Ethan smiled, wiping sweat from his brow. "I think it's my favorite place in the world now," he admitted. For both Ethan and Mr. Preston, the garden had become more than just a project. It was a living symbol of their shared journey, a testament to the power of kindness, friendship, and community. And as the seasons changed, so did the lives of those around them. The once isolated Mr. Preston was now a beloved figure in the neighborhood, while Ethan found himself growing into a confident young man, guided by the lessons he had learned from his mentor and friend. Ethan straightened the hem of his graduation gown, the fabric feeling both exciting and surreal against his skin. The once distant dream of graduating from the prestigious Maplewood Academy was now a reality, and today was the day he would celebrate that achievement with the two most important people in his life, his mother and Mr. Preston. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as students and their families filled the rows of chairs. Bright banners hung from the rafters, and the stage was adorned with flowers and the school's emblem. Ethan stood in the back with his classmates, waiting for the ceremony to begin, his heart pounding with a mixture of pride and nervousness. At home that morning, Miss Carter had struggled to hold back tears as she adjusted Ethan's cap. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice trembling. "You've worked so hard for this, Ethan. Your father would be too." Ethan hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of her words. He thought of the long nights spent studying, the moments of doubt he'd pushed through, and the endless encouragement from both his mother and Mr. Preston. When Mr. Preston arrived to pick them up, he had been wearing a suit that looked as sharp as his wit. "Well, look at you," he said with a grin, patting Ethan on the shoulder. "Ready to take on the world, are we?" "I hope so," Ethan replied with a laugh. Now, as the ceremony began, Ethan scanned the crowd until he found them. Carter and Mr. Preston, sitting side by side in the front row. His mother's face was radiant with pride, and Mr. Preston gave him a small, encouraging nod. One by one, the students were called to the stage to receive their diplomas. Ethan listened as the principal listed each graduate's accomplishments, applause filling the room after every name. Finally, it was his turn. "Ethan Carter," the principal announced, "graduating with honors in advanced literature and community leadership." The crowd erupted into cheers, but none were louder than those coming from Miss Carter and Mr. Preston. Ethan walked across the stage with his head held high, shaking the principal's hand as he accepted his diploma. The weight of the moment sank in. This wasn't just the culmination of his academic efforts. It was a testament to the values instilled in him by the people who believed in him. As he descended the stage, Ethan caught Mr. Preston's eye and saw something that made his chest tighten, a look of pure, unfiltered pride. After the ceremony, the graduates and their families spilled out onto the school lawn, where tables of refreshments awaited. Ethan barely had time to take a breath before he was enveloped in a warm hug from his mother. "You did it," Miss Carter exclaimed, her eyes glistening with tears. "My boy, you've made me so proud." Ethan hugged her back, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." Mr. Preston approached next, holding a small, elegantly wrapped box. "For you," he said, handing it to Ethan. Curious, Ethan tore the paper carefully and opened the box. Inside was a polished fountain pen engraved with his initials and a simple phrase, "Write your future." "It's beautiful," Ethan said, running his fingers over the engraving. "I thought you might need it," Mr. Preston said, his tone casual but his eyes warm. "Every great writer needs the right tools." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Preston, for everything." The older man gave a small, approving smile. "You've earned it, Ethan, and this is just the beginning. I can't wait to see what you'll do next." After a few more photos and congratulations, Ethan suggested they head to Mr. Preston's house. "I want to see the garden," he said. "It feels like the perfect place to celebrate." When they arrived, the garden was in full bloom, a vibrant explosion of color and life. Roses climbed the trellises, daisies swayed in the gentle breeze, and the sweet scent of lavender hung in the air. The three of them made their way to the wooden bench beneath the largest tree, a spot where Ethan and Mr. Preston had shared countless conversations. They sat together, sipping lemonade and enjoying the peacefulness of the space they had nurtured. "This garden," Ethan began, looking around, "it's like a part of us. We started with something neglected, something forgotten. And now look at it, it's alive, thriving." Mr. Preston nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Much like you, Ethan, you've grown into a remarkable young man. Watching you achieve this milestone has been one of the greatest joys of my life." Ethan turned to Mr. Preston, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I wouldn't be here without you. You've taught me so much, not just about school or life, but about what it means to care, to give back." Miss Carter chimed in, her voice gentle. "You've both given so much to each other, and I think that's what makes this bond so special." The three of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment, taking in the beauty of the garden and the weight of the day's significance. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the flowers, Mr. Preston turned to Ethan. "What's next for you, my boy?" Ethan smiled, his mind already racing with ideas. "College, for starters, and then, I don't know, maybe journalism or something in writing. I just know I want to make a difference." "Like you have." Mr. Preston chuckled softly. "Well, if anyone can, it's you. Just remember, your story is yours to write. Make it a good one." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within him. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time he felt ready to face it. As they walked back to the house, Ethan glanced over at Mr. Preston, his heart full of gratitude. The journey they had shared, the lost wallet, the scholarship, the garden, and the lessons had changed both of their lives. As they stepped into the warm glow of the house, Ethan knew that no matter where life took him, he would always carry Mr. Preston's wisdom and kindness with him. The weeks following Ethan's graduation felt like the calm after a storm. The structured days of school and the whirlwind of finals were now behind him, and for the first time, he had the space to reflect on how much his life had changed since that fateful afternoon when he found Mr. Preston's wallet. Ethan sat at his desk, turning the fountain pen Mr. Preston had gifted him over in his hands. The engraving, "Write Your Future," seemed to gleam in the light streaming through his bedroom window. Those words carried the weight of Mr. Preston's faith in him, and Ethan felt both inspired and humbled. He glanced over at a small framed photo on his desk. It was taken during his graduation celebration in the garden. In it, Ethan stood between his mother and Mr. Preston, all three of them smiling brightly. The garden behind them bloomed with color, a testament to their shared efforts and the bond they had built. Ethan smiled to himself, thinking of how the garden had become more than just a project. It was a reflection of the lessons he had learned: patience, care, and the importance of nurturing relationships. One sunny morning, Ethan visited Mr. Preston's house. He knocked on the familiar wooden door, and the older man greeted him with a warm smile. "Good to see you, my boy," Mr. Preston said, stepping aside to let him in. They made their way to the study, where shelves of books lined the walls. Mr. Preston poured them each a cup of tea before settling into his favorite armchair. "So," Mr. Preston began, his eyes twinkling, "what's next for you? Have you decided on a college yet?" Ethan nodded. "I have. I'll be attending Ridgefield University. They have a great journalism program, and I think it's the right fit for me." Mr. Preston beamed. "That's wonderful news, Ethan. You've always had a way with words. I can't wait to see the stories you'll tell." They spent the next hour discussing Ethan's plans for the future. He spoke about his excitement for college, his dream of becoming a journalist, and the kinds of stories he wanted to write. Stories that made a difference, just as Mr. Preston had made a difference in his life. As their conversation continued, Mr. Preston grew quiet for a moment. He reached into a nearby drawer and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "This," he said, handing it to Ethan, "was Margaret's journal. She used it to jot down ideas, thoughts, and dreams. I think it's time someone else put it to good use." Ethan took the notebook carefully, feeling the weight of its significance. The leather cover was smooth from years of use, and the pages inside held faint imprints of Margaret's handwriting. "Are you sure?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with emotion. Mr. Preston nodded. "She believed in sharing what you've learned, in passing on something meaningful. I think she'd want you to have it." Ethan swallowed hard, unable to find the words to express his gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, clutching the notebook close. "I'll treasure it." Their bond had deepened over the years, and Ethan realized that Mr. Preston had become more than just a mentor. He was family, a grandfather figure who had guided him through some of the most important moments of his life. As the summer days passed, Ethan spent more time at Mr. Preston's house, helping with small repairs, tending the garden, and playing their regular chess matches. The once reclusive man now welcomed neighbors into his home, often hosting small gatherings in the garden. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Ethan turned to Mr. Preston. "You've taught me so much," Ethan said, his voice steady, "about life, about kindness, and about what really matters. I wouldn't be the person I am today without you." Mr. Preston chuckled, though his eyes shone with emotion. "And you, Ethan, have given me something I thought I'd lost, a sense of purpose. You reminded me that life is meant to be shared, not hidden away behind closed doors." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet hum of the evening filling the air. As Ethan prepared to leave for college, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the day he found the wallet, the courage it had taken to return it, and the unexpected friendship that had blossomed as a result. On the morning of his departure, Ethan stopped by Mr. Preston's house one last time before leaving for Ridgefield University. The old man was waiting for him on the porch, his cane resting against the railing. "Well, this is it," Ethan said, his voice tinged with both excitement and sadness. Mr. Preston nodded, his expression a mix of pride and wistfulness. "It's not goodbye, Ethan. You've got a life to build, and I'll always be here cheering you on." Ethan stepped forward and embraced Mr. Preston tightly, feeling the warmth of the connection they had built over the years. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "Go write your story, my boy," Mr. Preston replied. "And don't forget to visit. This garden won't tend itself, you know." Ethan laughed through his tears. "I wouldn't dream of it." As he drove away, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as Mr. Preston waved from the porch. He felt a sense of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. The wallet had been just the beginning, a catalyst for a friendship that had changed both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Years later, as a journalist, Ethan would often look back on that moment. In his articles, he carried the lessons Mr. Preston had taught him: the value of honesty, the importance of connection, and the power of small acts of kindness. And every time he wrote a new story, he reached for the fountain pen, engraved with "Write Your Future," a reminder of the man who had believed in him from the very start. The story of Ethan Carter and Mr. Preston reminds us of the extraordinary power of honesty, kindness, and human connection. What began as a simple act of returning a lost wallet blossomed into a deep and transformative relationship. Ethan's courage to do the right thing, even when faced with personal challenges, set in motion a series of events that changed both his and Mr. Preston's lives for the better. Through their journey, we see the value of taking responsibility, building meaningful bonds, and giving back to the community. Mr. Preston, once a reclusive figure, found a renewed sense of purpose through his friendship with Ethan. Meanwhile, Ethan learned that integrity and perseverance could open doors he never imagined. This story serves as a beautiful reminder that small acts of kindness can ripple out, creating profound impacts not just for ourselves, but for those around us. It teaches us that growth and change are possible at any stage of life, and that genuine connections can bring light into the darkest corners of our hearts. Bookmark. If you found this story inspiring, let us know by commenting. 1. If you thought it was truly heartwarming, comment 2. We'd love to hear your own stories of kindness, honesty, or unexpected connections in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next inspiring tale. Share your thoughts about this story in the comment section. We can't wait to hear what it means to you.